One of the first images of a bird in flight is made of feathers. Removed from a once living kingfisher, the creaturely address of the animal's body is converted into its image. Fine, flexible threads are removed carefully from the rachis or rachis, an ornithological expert can tell me, or spine, to be cut, assembled, and overlapped, finally fixed on the surface of the page. Pliable barbs are removed and cut to form intricate details that momentarily disable our recognition of the feather itself. And yet it is the materiality of the feathers that make this transformation possible. Often part of the feather remains intact, so that the structure and coloration of the bird is discernible. Thin, iridescent threads become the shimmering blue back. The natural striations of duck feather evoke a brick facade below, and a peacock plumes are mixed with many others to depict the rough surface of the ground. The interface between human and animal is literally raised on the surface of these images, which is this image, meaning the kingfisher image, which is one of over 100 birds depicted in a 17th century libro di piume, or feather book, produced circa 1618 by Dionisio Minaggio, the chief gardener of the Spanish state of Milan. The feather collages draw upon featherwork traditions from New Spain to represent local birds and a cast of human figures indigenous to Lombardy. Its diverse subjects are composed through the intricate application of feathers, animal skin, beaks, talons, and leaves on the page. Raising the specious divide between nature and artifice, this remarkable object prompts the movement between materiality and mimesis, that is, the feather and the image. Although the feather book opens up multiple lines of inquiry, such as the history of costume, the history of music, and the history of science and collecting, my paper today introduces its importance to art history. In the first half of my paper, I describe the global and local context of the feather book's production. In the second half, I consider its participation in the close relation between art and nature in early modern collections. So part one, the feather book and its global and local contexts. So just to give you a representative sample of among the 156 images. So the feather book is a series of 156 images that were originally bound in a large leather embossed case that was disassembled after the object entered the Blacker collection in 1923. An impressive 112 images of birds dominate the corpus, sporadically interrupted by depictions of human figures, 16 hunters and bird trappers, 13 commedia dell'arte characters and actors, 8 musicians, 5 tradesmen or laborers, and 1 townscape. With a few exceptions, the avian and human subjects are predominantly indigenous to Lombardy. Among wild and domestic migratory and nesting birds local to the Po Valley surrounding Milan, we find 2 images of Amazonian parrots and 2 images of oriental hunting figures. Despite these scarce exotic inclusions, the local is reasserted through labels in red ink in the hand of the artist using a local Milanese dialect. Very little is known of the impetus for this remarkable series of images. The most certain information is given to us on the frontispiece, which state that the book was, quote, made and invented by Dionisio Minaggio, chief governor for the state of Milan in or by 1618. Although this is conventional, the reassertion of Minaggio's hand would be particularly important in this case of unprecedented ingenuity. The images were made in a kind of collage technique, cutting feathers in different ways to create a variety of effects, removing the quill to ensure a flat surface, and attaching them directly to the paper in overlapping patterns with an adhesive. The images of birds were begun by tracing and cutting the profile of the animal onto paper. Then, after applying the feathers and other materials, such as beak and talons, it was attached to a stiffer piece of backing paper. By contrast, the surrounding or contextualizing elements, landscapes, trees, the ground, etc., were made by first pasting feathers onto a piece of paper and then cutting out, i.e. kind of through the feather to become a sharp outline, cutting out the desired shapes before gluing them onto the same page as the bird or human figures. The only material that is not organic, i.e. the feathers or the taxidermied bird parts, are the eyes of the birds, which were made of concentric circles of paper. Although the frontispiece flags the making of the object and the invention necessary to do so, nearly nothing is known of Dionisio Minaggio except that he came from a family of gardeners working for at least two generations in Milan. In this position, Minaggio would have served the Spanish governor. Working in the most important political household in Spanish-occupied Lombardy, Minaggio was ostensibly responsible for an urban garden within the royal palace. Located adjacent to the Duomo, the center of religious power that remained in the control of the Milanese archbishops, the governor's palace was a political and cultural hub that would have likely included a garden and perhaps an aviary. Feathers from the possible aviary, as well as the kitchens and hunting activities, would have provided Minaggio with the local and exotic bird feathers necessary for such an immense labor. It would not be surprising to find exotic birds in an elite household during the Spanish colonization of New Spain. Not only living birds and taxidermy specimens were collected, but also the Aztec feather art made by amantecas, local artisans specializing in the craft. There are two techniques used in pre-Hispanic featherwork. In the first, three-dimensional objects, such as the cape I show here, were made of feathers by securing plumes which were left largely intact in place using agave cord. A famous example is the well-known production of voluminous capes made of incredibly rare tropical feathers by the Tupinamba of Brazil. The second technique is feather mosaic, which Spanish also called plumeria, or feather painting, using minute fragments of feathers, recombined to produce images with remarkable pictorialism and detail. Feather painting of this kind flourished in the early colonial period, when trade schools organized by missionaries produced works for the European market. Well-known examples of such featherworks were sent to Milan. The featherwork mitre of the Archbishop of Milan, for example, would have been known to the Spanish governor, living beside the Duomo where the Archbishop officiated Mass. Additionally, a Tupinamba cape from Brazil may have been given by a Prince Landi by Carlo Borromeo, who was the reforming archbishop at the time, in the 16th century, and this object is documented in the collection of Manfredo Satalla by the second half of the Seicento. These exotic objects were sources of admiration and attention in the hybrid and sociable spaces of early modern cabinets of curiosity, as well as more strictly religious and devotional contexts. They were moreover often given as gifts, mediating and cementing relations between colonial subjects and administrators at the distant site from which possession was imposed. The feather book does not speak to the Spanish possession of New Spain in a straightforward way. The local complicates the global in this case, and yet the uncertainty of its commissioning opens up the way that feathers shuttle back and forth between different agents, serving a multitude of intentions, desires, and concerns. Based on the frontispiece, we know who produced these images, but the recipient is not explicitly named. It is likely, of course, that it was given to the Gobernador of Milan acting in 1618, who would have been Minaggio's employer. Between 1616 and 1618, Don Pedro de Alvarez de Toledo Osario, the 5th Marquis of Villafranca, was appointed the King of Spain's representative in the Duchy of Milan. No archival documents have been uncovered to suggest that Dionisio Minaggio received a commission from Don Pedro for the feather book. However, a recent discovery suggests that he was indeed its recipient. In 1795, an exiled Jesuit visiting the library of the Descalcist, or the barefoot Franciscans at the convent of San Antonio in Merida, Spain, notes that this was the holding place of the library of Don Pedro and describes the presence of the feather book there. This discovery suggests that the impressive series of collages entered Don Pedro's possession before he left Milan in 1618 and were held in high esteem with his most prized possessions. It is possible that Minaggio produced the images of his own volition, perhaps over many years, and offered them as a gift to his employer, who was perhaps even a friend. The asymmetrical power relations between occupier and occupied is critical to the ethical and political stakes raised by the feather book, with its Lombard artist and subject matter, New World technique, and Spanish owner. Alessandro Russo has suggested that the relevance of the feather book could reflect his political ambitions for an appointment in the New World, and in fact his cousin was appointed Viceroy of New Spain in 1624. Yet I situate the object in a more local set of concerns, more important to our understanding of the feather book than any desired appointment or fantasy of colonial possession is the Lombard life depicted in the series of images. Indeed, Don Pedro's appointment as the governor of Milan appears to have been a pivotal turning point in his career. 5 years later, he was awarded the Grandeza de España, this is in 1623. As a grandee of Spain, Don Pedro entered the highest noble caste in Spain and was granted the title of the Marquis of Villafranca del Bierzo. Interactions between the Spanish occupiers and the local Lombard population were frequently fraught, especially in the early days, but eventually afforded the Milanese a degree of autonomy. The governor of Milan played a vital role in maintaining law and order and overseeing the interests of the Spanish crown. Each governor was directly appointed by the king, the absentee Duke of Milan, and was held by a Spanish citizen except in 2 cases. In the 16th century, these governors frequently acted independently of the king, with unchecked powers, and actively worked to weaken the local state political apparatus. Crucially, during his rule, Philip II had instructed his representative to take an approach of conciliation and compromise toward the people in the Milanese elite of the occupied territory. Indeed, local identities remain and allow communities a degree of autonomy to contest their subjugation. This might tend in another direction here. The Lombards, described as barbarous by Machiavelli and linked to the rural peasant class by Baldassare Castiglione, could have invited association as an objectified other by the Spanish. The argument could therefore be made that the conversion of feather into image appropriates the indigenous art of New Spain to other a local indigenous population, the flora, fauna, and peoples of Lombardy, for the Spanish governor. Although I feel that this is part of the way the Feather Book operates, it does not address the Spanish position of collaboration with the Milanese. In the second part of my presentation today, I'll question and decenter the importance of the global other to its meaning. The material presence of the local land, the feathers themselves, makes space for more embodied and ethical encounter that undoes hierarchical power relations and the association with indigenous feather art of New Spain. Although immobilized, the feathers open up a passage for knowledge that is fueled by a complex set of desires, producing multivalent encounters between the images and their purported owner in the context of an elite library. So I move now to consider the Feather Book and the conversion of nature into art. And I'm showing you here 2 images of hunters. I have a different image at the back of the room. So the stakes of the Feather Book are ethical as much as political, raising the nature of the relation between self and other, subject-object, nature-artifice, man and animal. The fact that the Feather Book begins with a series of hunters and bird trappers seems to affirm Don Pedro's position of superiority over the land and peoples of Lombardy. However, the presence of the feathers, I suggest, complicates the subject matter and opens up the space between feather and image to produce new relations. Recent scholarship has begun to reveal a more complex intersubjective relationship between man and animal in the early modern period. Marcy Norton, for example, has compared the bonds and understanding between the owners of falcons and chickens in early modern falconry and husbandry treatises. As Norton argues, instructions regarding interspecies encounters in these texts reveal that falcons were granted a degree of subjectivity that was not afforded to chickens reared for food. Through intimate care of the falcon over a prolonged period of time, a relationship develops that acknowledges the subjectivity of these companion animals and their existence as a singular and unique being. Similar interactions are represented in the first pages of the Feather Book, where a hunting falcon is shown with his owner on horseback. It's on page 2 of the book, following Minaggio's order. Some examples of raptors are included in its ornithological images, although none are given the trappings of a tamed animal. Intriguingly, the use of owls and birding is given more emphasis here. In addition to the image of a bird trapper with tamed owl on page 6, a close-up of a tethered owl on its perch is represented near the end of the book on page 150. I included that here. It's in the back anyways, and I have another image of it in a moment. So Minaggio's interest in these practices seems to directly draw upon the descriptions and printed images in treatises on birding and hunting. The practice of using owls to trap birds is depicted in a 1622 treatise on bird catching aviaries, the Uccelliera, which is held in the collection here, by Giuseppe Olina. Such treatises included instructions on the art of capturing birds, raising them in captivity, and caring for their illness, in addition to more descriptive discussion of various species. Additionally, some included information about taxidermy, and Italian scholars have suggested that Minaggio was informed by such sources when he began the process of preserving the beaks and talons for his Feather Book. As a respected member within the household of Don Pedro in Milan, it is probable that Minaggio had access to such books and perhaps drew upon them in his care of the owner's estate. And here I just give you another example of the way that it seems clear that there's some direct reference to these printed sources in the iconography of the Feather Book. Crucially, images of birds in profile are included in these birding treatises, suggesting that Minaggio drew visual as well as textual information from their pages. Likewise, similar images of bird specimens in profile proliferated in ornithological treatises during the 16th century. Ornithology, what we now call the scientific study of birds, would have carried a connotation of care in the 17th century when the term developed through its etymological derivation from the Greek ornithologo, or treating of birds. Ulysses Aldrovandis' treatise on birds, Ornithologi, demonstrated the desire for a new knowledge about birds, moving towards increased categorization and observation, while it drew on existing ancient and earlier 16th century investigations. Published between 1599 and 1603, and then in numerous editions in the 17th century, Aldrovandi includes information about the bird's geographic distribution, various names, dietary or medicinal uses, sexual habits and differentiation, and a range of cultural different references. Aldrovandi commissioned painters and printmakers to create surrogate images of his collection and sent him accurate representations of specimens that he did not own, which were then used as visual models in the creation of woodcut prints that appeared in Aldrovandi's text. The network of artists that Aldrovandi employed included northern Italian artists working in the courts of Florence, Mantua, and Ferrara, as well as Milan. Such images were reported to have been produced al vivo or from life in a direct encounter between the artist and the animal. Moving through these circuits, the visual representation of the natural world in the lifelike painted illustrations staged a scene of collaboration between nature and artifice, albeit emphasizing human artistry. The conversion of feather into image emphasizes the mastery and discernment of human agents who are capable of transforming nature and improving upon it. Yet despite the shift toward representation, the material presence of naturalia continued to be a source of fascination and value at this time. Opera plumeria abound in these collections. In Milan, Satella owned many examples of such images in and on stone, in addition to Tupinamba cape and feather mosaics. Featherworks were taken seriously as a site of artistic value and debate that prompted discussion of the role of imitation in painting and artistic creation more generally. The material presence of the natural world was part of such debates, as an art form in which, quote, one is required to extract from nature not only the models but also the tools and materials, end quote. The importance of materiality for owners of feather art is made explicit in the feather mosaic of St. Jerome, originally located in the Kunst- und Wunderkammern in Amherst Castle, Austria. So here I'm showing you Manfredo's and Satalla's collection in Milan and the Tupinamba cape and a beautiful illustration of it that was produced in Mantua. And here's the St. Jerome in Austria. Made it from hummingbird feathers by an unknown Amanteca in New Spain during the third quarter of the 16th century, this exquisitely rendered image was framed in a remarkable way. A taxidermy hummingbird was attached to the frame, drawing attention to what the image itself worked so hard to obscure through the fine work of the artist. Other kinds of collectible images manipulate and convert natural materials. Jacopo Ligozzi, who worked prolifically as a painter for Ulysses Aldrovandi, also designed pietra dura, inlaid semi-precious stonework for decorative tabletops and pictorial altarpieces. The ability of stone to stand in for other surfaces and substances is even more evocative in pietra paesina, or landscape stone, a type of stone found in Tuscany that could be cut and polished to emphasize the illusion of a landscape. Similarly, painting on marble and other precious stones allow for the effects and marbling to evoke the sky, clouds, or other settings for a narrative scene. Such objects were incredibly popular in early modern collections and spoke to the generative role of nature as well as the role of human artistry. Like feathers, these stones made image demonstrate that not only the creativity with which artists harnessed the natural ability of nature to produce pictorial effects, but the appetite for objects that investigate the permeable border between nature and artifice. So in this context, Dionisio Minaggio's Feather Book is not only a visual representation of Lombard life, it is its literal embodiment on the page. In fact, rather than allow the full transformation of matter into image, these feathers, beaks, talons, skin, and leaves seem to resist conversion into the representational mode. The retention of the real serves to heighten the affective nature of the encounter between subject and object, suggesting that this was a site of reciprocity and exchange. The exact nature of these networks requires further research into the agents, both human and non-human, within which the owner and artist of the feather book were embroiled. We can imagine the large, heavy volume brought out for display by the former governor, perhaps already a grandee of Spain, in his palace at Villafranca. He would do so, perhaps, alongside related books in his library, such as Alina's Uccelliera and Aldrovelli's Ornithologi. In this regard, the presence of the feathers could have been the ideal medium for the Milanese gardener, who enacted a different kind of treatment of birds than the ornithological impulses of Aldrovandi and the more objectifying printed images he produced for his publications. The direct address of the tamed horned owl here seems to be a visual analog for the insertion of the real in the feather book, and by extension for Minaggio himself. Feather, artist, and owl confront the viewer directly, and all are ultimately tamed. Thank you.